Hey squad, welcome back. Now today I want to talk to you about the importance of being a specialist as a producer. So if you're going to wear the producer's hat, you need to specialize in producing. Now I'm not saying you can't be a specialist at engineering as well, but production is a very specific discipline. And if you want to call yourself a producer, you ought to focus on making that your specialism. I'm sure many of you have become stuck in a situation where you are trying to be a jack of many trades, but ending up becoming a master of none. And I've certainly had that experience, but there are some simple steps you can take to ensure that you are recognized as a specialist in your field. Anyway, it's that time, so let's get into it. Now, like many of you guys watching this, my musical journey began in church. As a kid, I used to admire the older guys playing in the church band. One day, a guy would be playing the bass. The next week, he'll be on the drums or on the keys, and the guitarist might be on the horn. And it was just fantastic to see how all of the musicians pretty much were able to jump onto another musical instrument and be fantastic at it. Now, as I grew older and was able to join the band, I too had the opportunity of learning and performing on different musical instruments. In fact, I started off on the keyboard, then I moved to bass. I tried out a bit of drums and a little bit of guitar, but primarily bass and keyboards were my area. Now, despite the fact that I was pretty good on the bass and the keyboards, if I was called to play in someone else's band or to record something in a recording session, I would generally be required to come and play bass because that's what was considered my specialism. And it was the same for the majority of my friends who were incredibly competent on a range of musical instruments. However, when it came to sessions, they'd be called for a specific instrument. Fast forward a bit to the late 80s when I began producing. I was fortunate to have a great recording studio space, a fantastic live room, and a great control room. I had some really good equipment as well, and a pretty decent mixing desk. Now, my productions pretty much started out like this. I'd program up some drums using my drum machine. I'd use my MIDI sequencer to program some MIDI parts, keyboards and such, and I'd lay down a bass line. Once I'd gotten those basic ideas down, I then turned to specialists to come in and lay down the drums, lay down some keyboard parts, maybe some Hammond organ or something along those lines where I knew I wasn't that great. I'd call in guitarists, horn players, vocalists, all of these people who were actually specialists in their own discipline. Now, I accept that costs money and it costs time and it wasn't as convenient as it is today, but the advantage of that was I was able to benefit from the input, the ideas, the creativity, and the talent of a multitude of people. Now, things are very different today, of course, because we can actually do it all now in the box. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is this. In just the same way musicians are called upon for their specialist discipline, the same way a producer should be a specialist in his or her field. You see, back in the day when I finished my recording project, I'd take my multi-track reels off to another studio and hand them over to a mixing engineer to produce a great mix for me. Now, don't get me wrong, it was possible for me to do a mix in my studio, but the fact is, mixing engineers are specialists at mixing. Whereas I was a musician developing my production skills, and although I knew I could come up with a decent mix, I wasn't a specialist at mixing. Now, I decided rather than wasting time and relying on guesswork to try and come up with a decent mix, I opted to hand over my project to someone who knew exactly what they were doing in the mixing sphere. Now, their studios were kitted out with gear that was more in line with mixing, whereas my studio was more geared towards recording and production. Anyway, once the mix engineer finished my mix, I collect that on a digital audio tape, a DAT tape, and head over to yet another studio for mastering. Now, mastering to me was just pure wizardry. The studios were very, very different to your ordinary recording or mixing studio. They had equipment there that you wouldn't see anywhere else outside of a mastering studio. Very expensive, very specialist kit that I wouldn't necessarily be using in the production process. So of course, I'd leave my project with a mastering engineer who would work their magic. And by the end of it, I'd have a product that had been produced by a specialist, mixed by a specialist, and mastered by a specialist. Okay, 3 different people. Okay, so let's fast forward to present day and examine how incredible our situation is. We have amazing tools at our disposal. Wonderful digital audio workstations, amazing plugins, amazing sample packs, amazing outboard gear, hardware, all of that right in our home studio or whatever. The sort of quality that we can achieve these days is insane compared to what we used to have to go through back in the day. Unfortunately, however, this abundance of resource has introduced a level of laziness and apathy that is really sad. You see, I come across individuals on a daily basis who somehow choose to wear the producer's hat, but have no idea what production is, nor do they care about becoming proficient in the understanding of what the discipline is all about. You see, it's become so easy to dial up a few plugins and throw them onto a vocal track and let's see what happens, rather than actually figuring out what the best tools are to enhance that vocal. Now, don't get me wrong, it's great to improvise and to experiment and explore and try out new things, but unfortunately many of the individuals I encounter who would call themselves musicians or producers or whatever seem to think that the tools are what make the producer. We've talked about this before. Now, I try to explain that if someone gives me a plumber's toolkit, that doesn't make me a plumber. Or if I'm given a mechanic's toolkit, I'm not a mechanic. I could become a great mechanic, but just having the tools at my disposal doesn't make me a specialist in that field. And the same thing applies to music production. Because you've got these tools at your disposal, it doesn't mean that you are a specialist in that field. Now, it does disappoint me somewhat when I encounter individuals who seem to believe that they are able to wear the producer's hat, the mixing engineer's hat, and the mastering engineer's hat, simply because they have access to the plugins that can be used for those jobs. And sadly, they don't seem to pay much attention to the fact that mixing engineers and mastering engineers would have spent many years developing their skills, investing in themselves, investing in their talent, in equipment, in study, in training, to be able to competently call themselves specialists in mixing or mastering. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's impossible to become a specialist in all 3 of these areas. No, it definitely is possible. But what I'm trying to say is, if you want to wear the hat of a producer, become a specialist in production. Then if you want to branch out and do other things, such as mixing and whatever else, invest in yourself and up your skills, your understanding, and your expertise in those other disciplines. Now, I hope this makes sense to you. You see, I myself got caught in that trap when the digital audio revolution began in the early 2000s, and I certainly fooled myself into thinking, okay, great, I've got all of these amazing plugins, all of these amazing tools, I can now wear all of these different hats. In reality, it didn't quite work out like that. The fact is, until I started to invest time and effort and resource into training myself to become proficient in these other disciplines, a mix engineer or even a mastering engineer, which I still don't consider myself to be. Anyway, if you found value in this content, do remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me some feedback in the comment section. It's always appreciated. And don't forget as well to check out the other episodes in this series of motivation for producers. Links will be on the screen. Until next time, peace.